In today's podcast, I am pleased to be joined by the professional punter and author of the 100 Days of Tweets series on betting, Luke Paton. Welcome to the podcast, Luke. How are you?
Hi, very good, thank you.
Now, as I mentioned, you are the man behind the initial 100 Days of Tweets on betting, which has now proven so popular you are going beyond 100, up to 109 and counting, I believe. Is that right?
Yep, I'm not quite sure when it's going to end, but I think the industry provides lots of content, so we've still got a little way to go yet.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if there's a goal for a certain number, but we'll talk about that and the motivations, reasons behind these tweets a bit later on. But I want to get to know you first of all, especially those people not familiar with you. Now, you describe yourself as a professional punter. How long have you been doing that and betting for a living?
So, been a professional punter since I left Betfair in 2012. So, sole job, not done anything else. 10 years now, and then for eight and a half years before that, I was at Betfair. So been in the industry best part of 20 years now.
Okay, so you went from university effectively to working for Betfair, is that right?
There was a couple of bits and pieces. So I did some professional gambling or professional betting when I left university for a couple of years. Didn't end up going as I would have hoped. Some pretty tough lessons learned. But I think that all sort of stands in good stead. And then I ended up joining Betfair, and yeah, the rest of the say is history.
Okay. And what was it that made you go and join Betfair? Did you have a love of betting prior to going to work for Betfair? Because I imagine it was probably around the time that internet betting was exploding and Betfair obviously was new on the scene.
Yeah, so I think you would sort of take it a step further back. I've always been obsessed by sport. Little, just, football, cricket, all these other sports, they were, I was absolutely obsessed by them. I'd get up at 3:00 in the morning to go and watch the cricket from Australia, and it's always been a massive part of my life. And then you sort of go to university and, up to this point, never really done any betting. You'd have a couple of pounds each way on, Grand National and that sort of stuff, but very little. No one in the family did it. And just go to university, you meet like-minded people, and, you end up having a few bets and you realise there might be something there in your naivety. And sort of carries on from there, really. And then, I was doing well enough. I thought I could make a living out of it, and it transpired that I probably wasn't ready to make a living out of it. And I ended up going to work for Betfair, and as I say, it was good. I really enjoyed time at Betfair, and it was a really good time to join Betfair as well, because as you say, it was in the early, so when I first got into betting in say late 90s, early 2000s, it's when internet betting was first coming around. At the time, you still had a lot of phone bookmakers, and there wasn't that much internet betting. I mean, there was some, but there wasn't loads. And so as it began to get bigger was in the formative years of when I was really sort of interested in it. And so even in 2004, Betfair had been around for 4 or 5 years, but it was still pretty early days.
Yeah. So I was just thinking back then to what you said about the love of sports and numbers. I was just thinking there's probably a lot of people who played the game Championship Manager, if you ever played that one. I know it's just the football management game.
I've certainly had a sore side from being sat there playing it for 15 hours at a time, and yeah, it's the sort of things you do as a kid.
But exactly, yeah.
But I as much enjoyed playing sport as watching it, and in terms of the numbers, it wasn't necessarily the numbers that really sort of captured the imagination. It was more just a love of sport.
Mm-hmm. So that combined obviously with the growing of the betting industry and Betfair. So what was it like working at Betfair? Because it's obviously a very different company these days. Was it the things that you learned there? Was it the people that you work with? What was most influential in terms of shaping your betting?
So I think the people you end up meeting. So I was in market operations, and to put it into some sort of context, I'll explain what market operations did.
Yep.
So whenever you saw a market on site, it was the operations team who would be responsible for what I'd call the life cycle of a market. So we would decide which markets go on site. We decide which runners. We decide on the rules and regs of that market. The management of the market, so making sure that bets were cancelled when it went in play, suspended when it finished, settled correctly. The whole sort of process from start to finish, we were sort of responsible for. And, we were doing thousands of markets a week. And there'd be other things like you'd liaise with liquidity providers. So we weren't pricing markets up ourselves.
No.
But people would contact us saying, can you offer this market? If you offer this market, we'll provide some liquidity for it. And so you're sort of building relationships that way as well, in terms of garnering a bigger understanding of what's involved with Betfair. So that was how it sort of started off. And then as time went on, Betfair changed quite a lot, as inevitably things like casino came along. And in my last year there, the sports book, a lot of time was spent integrating the exchange and sports book.
Mm-hmm.
But most importantly, it was, I'm still very good friends with a lot of people who I met from my time at Betfair. And a lot of them have gone on to become, very successful gamblers. And, it's fascinating really to me.
Of course, yeah. Do you still use that network of contacts these days? Are they people that you reach out to when, obviously, as a professional bettor?
Yeah. So, I mean, some of them, are my best friends, and we'll have Zoom calls on a Thursday night, which is almost a legacy of COVID, where we used to try and do it, once a week, and we still actually do it quite regularly. But, talk to, guys who own syndicates and all sorts of different people within the industry. And so, talking to these guys quite a lot in terms of what's happening in, the betting side of it. And, you get a pretty good picture as to an overall picture of what's happening. They're, as I say, they're some of my very best friends. And, so it's been nice.
Sounds really good. Yeah. And then you were there for 8.5 years. And so at some point during that period, you obviously was betting yourself because you jumped into professional punting. Were you doing a lot of betting alongside your work at Betfair at the time?
So not necessarily early on, because I think I was being bitten a little bit by my time after university. So it took me quite a while to get back on the horse as such. But I was in a situation that when I left Betfair in 2012, I didn't need to go and look for another job. I was doing well enough that, I was perfectly happy with what I was doing in terms of punting, that it was the thing that made, most sense for me to focus my attentions on.
Yep.
And if I'm honest, towards the end of my time at Betfair, sort of gets in the way a little bit. The job's getting in the way a little bit of what you're actually doing. And the problem is always going to be that, if you're not earning huge money in a job and you're earning decent money punting, tough to stay motivated, I think, in a normal job.
Of course, if you get, there's probably a tipping point, isn't there, whereby if you're demotivated at work and you're making good money outside of that, which is more interesting to you, then that's going to focus your attention. So what happened at the end at Betfair there? I understand there was a new CEO came in and changed things a little bit, and that kind of helped.
About a year before I left is obviously the sports book. We knew the sports book was coming, and a lot of time and effort was put on merging the sports book with the exchange to make sure there was continuity between the two. And I had quite a big role in making sure from an exchange perspective that, all the rules were right and all these sorts of things. And it was quite interesting, some of the stuff. But at the same time, what happened is there were some big organizational changes after Brion came in. He brought in a couple of guys and, their job was to reorganize the operational teams. At the time, there were 3 offices. There was one in Hammersmith, there was one in Dublin, and there was one in Stevenage. And, Hammersmith was where a lot of the sort of legacy employees who'd been there a long time were. And they were desperate to get people away from Hammersmith up to Stevenage. And in terms of reshaping operations, that's what they ended up doing. So I ended up leaving because I didn't want to work from Stevenage full time. I had no interest in that, to be honest. And it's interesting that you look at where the operational teams are now, that most of them are in Romania, and the quality of the operations teams now is not great. Anytime I have issues with customer services, it's dreadful. So yes, you can save costs, but it comes at a price. But it was fascinating to see, to be honest, the whole, and I think that was what was really interesting about working at Betfair, was you just got to see how big companies work and all the different aspects to it. So you saw the tech teams, you saw the legal teams, you saw, the marketing teams, marketing campaigns, you saw the whole picture as to what it takes for a big company to be successable.
We could probably do a whole podcast on Betfair, I'm sure.
It's not that exciting, honestly.
Well, obviously when these days, it's, it started off as an exchange. Obviously, the introduction of the sportsbook seemed to have changed, the approach of Betfair as a company. So do you think that was the start of that when the sportsbook was being introduced? Was there?
No, it was before that. It was before that. So there were probably 2 or 3 instances. So one was when they had exchange games, which was like a casino, but it was in an exchange format, basically. And then casino came after that. once they were willing to take risk themselves, then that, it changed the whole dynamic, and things like the sportsbook were just inevitable, to be honest, after that. So I think that was when it went from this amazing peer-to-peer concept to actually just being like another bookmaker, really, with within exchange as a side product.
Yeah. And then obviously premium charge and all these other things came in. For people interested, actually, I should say there's a really good podcast with, it's on the Risk of Ruin podcast series with Andrew Black, Bert. I don't know if you've listened to that, but it talks about the changes across the time of Betfair from its early days. But that's a really interesting listen for people who want to know more about Betfair. But I want to ask you then about that change. Obviously, you jumped into pro punting. Did you have a bankroll at the time? Were you?
Yeah, actually, I had done well enough in the sort of year preceding that I had a nice bankroll. Actually got some money off Betfair, which was nice as well. And so, yeah, I was in a nice position. And it's a strange game in that when things are going well and you're making money, it feels like the easiest thing in the world, to be honest. And you're not worried too much about bankrolls and things like that when, things are going great.
They're nice problems to have, aren't they? How much is the stake on this? How much should I increase my? Yeah.
Well, I mean, look, everything's relative. So, you have to be sensible and everything else, but it's a lot easier than it can be at times.
What did the people around you make of that decision? Were they supportive of you? Is that been important to you to have that, support base to allow you to go and do something perhaps quite risky like this?
I think probably the most important thing was I didn't have a wife and 3 children at the time, and it does make a big difference in terms of sort of your attitude to risk, in terms of what you're willing to do and the chances you're willing to take. I knew that if it didn't work out, then I could go and get another job in the industry, and take it from there. It's different type of pressure when you're providing for wife and children. I'm fortunate in that the wife has a good job, and it takes some of the pressure off me. I certainly know friends who have been the sole breadwinner as such, doing this for a job, and there's a lot of pressure if you're the only one in the family earning. So I'm lucky in that I don't have that pressure in quite the same extent.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask you about the lack of that steady wage and how you cope with the ups and downs. I've spoken to other guests in the past, and they just have one bankroll and they, just take some money out as they need it, I suppose. Do you have an approach to it? Do you treat it like pay yourself a wage or a salary of some kind?
No, I would say something similar in terms of, I keep certain records, and I've gone through certain periods and certain years where I might go, right, this year, if I can make this is how I would distribute the money and all that sort of stuff. But I think as time goes on, is the less targets you actually have, the better you are, because you're not trying to force things, or you're not trying to chase, it's not been a great year so far. Oh, I need this amount of money. With betting generally, the more you can let it come to you rather than you chasing it, I think it makes a massive difference in terms of your end results.
I see. So no targets. That's interesting, because I think a lot of people, or people I speak to as well, they say, I want to make X amount this year, or I expect to make, to double my bank this year or something like that. But that's not how betting works, and it puts that pressure on it. That does make sense. So, and
don't get me wrong, and say the 10 years is we've had multiple losing years within that. And I remember one year was a dreadful year, and there's been plenty of good years in there. You might have a break-even year or two in there as well. And what I've always found is if you have the less pressure you can put yourself under, the better. It's such a mentally draining game. You don't need to be putting extra pressure on yourself to achieve something.
Yeah, it probably will surprise people to think that you could have a losing year and you're a professional bettor, but that's the reality of probably some of the markets you're betting into.
Well, I think people they have no idea how, variance truly works, and, and just how bad you can run. I've been on runs that would literally blow people's minds. They'd be like, that's not possible. And, I always say to people whenever I'm asked about it is, imagine the worst run you've ever been on and times it by 5. And then you begin to get close to how badly you can run. It can be just insane. And ultimately, it's just a numbers game. The longer you do this job, the more markets you're betting on, the higher the likelihood that you'll go on some great runs, but also that you go on some absolutely horrendous runs.
Yeah. But how do you benchmark that? And how do you still have confidence in whatever you're betting upon, your models, to know that the edge hasn't gone and I'm not following this particular strategy over a cliff? How do you provide that comfort that I think, well, it's a terrible losing run, but the edge is still there. I just need to stick it out.
It's tough. I always say it's one of the toughest parts is having belief that you still have an edge and that It's not just a case of, you're thinking you have an edge and you don't actually have an edge. And I think you get a bit of a gut feel. And I talked about it before that we did some MBA in running, and it was amazing how many times we always seemed to be on the wrong side of these crazy little runs of 8-10 points from a team. And, it always felt just a little bit unlucky. But there was always a nagging feeling that there was something sort of bigger at play that we just weren't quite getting. And I think that we just didn't quite understand the sport enough in terms of some of its nuances. And I think, gut feel, in the end, you walk away from it and you go, okay, maybe we couldn't beat in running basketball. You have to be honest with yourself as well. So you'll get a good idea when you're betting as to whether you've been unlucky or not, whether you're running badly or not. If you bet on horses and, you continue having seconds, then you're probably placing okay bets. But, if everything's running out the back, then things are probably slightly amiss.
Mm-hmm.
So it all depends on, I think you just get a feel a little bit. It's not as easy to just calculate as people might think.
It's not a matter of you calculating the expected value on a bet and then tallying that up against your actual performance.
In terms of calculating the expected value, a lot of the time that's based on your models in the first place.
Yeah.
Right. So if your models are not correct in the first place, is what you think your value isn't necessarily what value you actually have.
Mm-hmm.
So I know in America they do a lot of stuff in terms of prices against something called closing line value. So prices you're taking relative to where the market ends up settling. And you could do something similar on Betfair, where if a golfer's going off at 20s and you got 26s, you're assuming that the market's efficient and that you're getting value. Now, the problem with that is it can be massively distorted by things like tipsters and other things. So it's not always as simple as assuming that market price is always efficient.
No, that's really interesting. Yes, because the market could be quite weak, or there could be other factors at play which have, skewed it. So the price you're taking, for example, Betfair SP, if you're looking at a horse race, you could have quite a weak market or an outsider where the Betfair SP is out of sync because of the weight of money on it. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Let's talk about the sports you bet on then. And what's the most, I think I know what the answer is. What's the main sport that you bet on at the moment?
Golf in running's the main thing doing at the moment. So in the tweets, I've talked about the need to adapt. And, if I talk you through a brief timeline of,
yes, please,
say, golf punting, for me, it gives you an idea as to how you need to adapt and the problems that you face as a punter. So I started off really, it was a lot of each way, match bets, these sorts of things, which tend to, have nice margins, nice returns, slightly softer markets.
Is that like 8 places rather than 5?
So it tended to be before that. So when I used to do it, it would have been back in 2015, 2016, that sort of time. And so you only really got more than 6 places for the majors. So that it's really been a relatively new thing to get the 8 places and 10 places and all that sort of stuff. So it was back in the day when, you'd get 5-6 places, so there weren't tons of decisions you had to make in terms of which was the best prize. So we would look on a Monday and say, we want this player. So say there might have been 3 players, and we may have decided that we want to back that player to win, I don't know, £50,000 or something like that. And so if, say, we wanted to back Chris Kirk at 50-1, and I was needing to get £1,000 each way on him. And you then have the logistics of trying to sort that out. And at the time, obviously, I had a lot of accounts, obviously not all in my own name. And, that's just part of the game. And you sort of go through the process of, you look at Odds Checker and, you might have 8 firms that are at 50-1. Now, bear in mind, some of those firms are linked. So obviously, Paddy Power and Betfair now, obviously they weren't back in the day, Ladbrokes and Corals. And so it was just a never-ending battle to try and not get the prices cut on Odds Checker. Mm-hmm. So you might have £25 here each way, and using shops as well. And the reality is, it's very difficult unless you've got some great accounts. And I did have some great accounts, but very difficult to not get prices chopped across the board very quickly when you're trying to get, say, £1,000 each way on a golfer at 50-1
on a Monday.
Well, we deliberately leave it as late as possible. So back in those days, not many people were putting up tips on a Monday. There was a few on sort of Tuesday evening. And, if possible, we would, you'd look at the strength of the market. And if the price was disappearing, you might then choose to hit shops and counts a bit harder on a Tuesday. And then if you could leave it to the Wednesday, you would leave it to the Wednesday, because, something I've talked about in the tweets is that the way the back end is set up for these bookmakers is that they will have limits that increase as the week goes on closer to the tournament, in terms of how much money it takes before they actually change their prices and the amount of money that they'll accept on bets. So the later you can leave it, bigger the bet you could potentially have. But you're in a position where suddenly you've got £400 each way on a player, and the price has gone everywhere. So you can't get any more than that on the prices, because it just doesn't exist anymore. And so it ended up becoming an enormous struggle in terms of actually getting the bets on that you wanted. And so we decided to move from the each way betting stuff and the other point about betting each way and betting in shops is you're carrying large amounts of cash, and it's pretty dangerous, to be honest. Yeah. It's not much fun. And so you then move to win-only markets on Betfair, and it was rare that a bookie's price would compare favourably to Betfair price. So, 90% of the bets you're placing would be on Betfair. Not always. I mean, you occasionally got a few others where you could place with bookies, but as a general rule, you would place them onto Betfair. And again, you ended up with similar types of problems where on a European Tour event, you might be able to, let's say we wanted to win £50,000, is you might only be able to win £16,000 or £17,000 on it, on that tournament. And even on PGA Tour events, it was struggle to get more than 30,000 before the price completely disappeared. And the problem you have it as well is that you combine that with majors where you could get £750,000 on if you wanted. It's very difficult not to completely distort your year, or have your year distorted by the majors.
Yeah.
So the majors are sort of making or breaking your year quite spectacularly, and it's not really a great position to be in where 4 difficult tournaments is what makes or breaks your year.
Yeah.
And you also had the other problem, and I've talked about it before again in tweets and elsewhere, was I'll give you an example of problems we were sort of encountering. So I really liked a golfer called Shubanka Sharma. I knew there's a high chance I'd back him in Malaysia. Seen him a few weeks before. I knew he loved the course. It was really a case of waiting to see what the field he was up against was and what price he came in at. And, on the Monday, priced 80-1, thinking, great. And, nibbling away, having a few small bets here and there, using, didn't have many bookmaker accounts left at that time, have access to. And so, a few small bets. And then 8:00 on the Monday evening, Ben Coley has tipped him up, his headline tip, and you're there going, great. And then so it puts you in a tricky position because the shops aren't open. You don't have access to any more sort of online accounts. And so I had to make a decision, and I ended up putting a massive bet up on Betfair at 75s. I think I put £14,000 or £15,000 up at 75s at the time, and people were talking about it on Twitter and like, oh, BNF, people are just following you so they can then hedge their bets, the next day when the price has crashed and all this sort of stuff. And obviously the price did go down considerably, and I'd seen something at Betfair that given me pause for thought, and that was when Harry Finley had a dog running at Wimbledon in one of the heats. It's the first time I'd ever seen £1 million bet on Betfair, and he put it may not have been quite 1 million, it was certainly several 100,000 he put up on Betfair, and he ended up getting a good chunk of money matched eventually. And, I thought with Sharma, what other options do I have? I can't drip feed money into the market. It's just not going to happen. So I left a large chunk up there, and I moved it a little bit over the next day or so, and I had a bit matched, not crazy amounts. And then on the Wednesday, Steve Palmer comes along. It's his headline tip in the Racing Post at 50-1. And, at that point, enough is enough. And I think I was lucky enough he ended up winning and, won about 100K or something. But what it did was it just highlighted what a struggle things had become to actually get decent sized bets on and not have the tipsters and everyone else completely distort markets.
It's a perfect storm there.
It just became a nightmare. And so in the end, went from that allied with the whole sort of problem in terms of not being able to get enough on in the other markets, ended up moving to in-running betting. And then in-running betting itself has its own problems in terms of the TV delays were massive, the leaderboards were useless. And so I ended up having to send people to events to be able to actually bet on these markets properly, which is logistically a challenge.
Yeah.
And it's expensive, and people think, oh, it's easy money. It's just anything but. But you're in a position where you could leave bets up on the site with a fair degree of confidence. You felt comfortable with the markets you were playing in. And then COVID came along and obviously stopped all that. And then in the interim, IMG now have a website which they then sell to Bet365, Boyle Sports, and others. And it's very good relative to what it used to be. It's still not perfect, but it's pretty good, and it's good enough for to enable you to sort of trade off.
Okay, so are you still doing the in-running betting now? So where are you taking?
Yes.
Is that on that particular website, IMG?
No. So if you just go to Bet365 and you click on the golf and you click on the leaderboard, and you get to see each shot as it's played. So
right,
it comes up with a little warning just before someone's about to play a shot, so you know that you can cancel your bets and that sort of stuff. So
right, yeah. Because I was going to ask you about the live feed, because often video is queued up about a golfer taking a shot, a putt, or something like that. So it's not live, is it?
No, and so there's a whole series of problems with it. But that was the one way to sort of try and get around it. And after COVID, made a decision that we just go with the leaderboard that's there, and it's a lot less stressful. And it's not, the information is not quite as good, but it's also not bad. So, but that's where we're at. But I think it shows you is that as you go along the journey, you need to adapt in terms of what you're doing. And you may have an edge in one thing, but the reality is you may not be able to maximize that edge. And, getting on and all these things, it really is difficult.
Of course, because, you had Sharma that won and he won you 100 grand, but it probably was a bittersweet victory because you're thinking, how much should I have won if I'd been able to get everything I wish to get on this particular golfer? So the in-play, though, is intriguing. So do you price it up at the start of each day, or are you doing it dynamically throughout the course of each day and you sit there watching the golf, watching the screens?
Just mainly do final day. I'll watch most of the golf the rest of the week. I won't always be playing on it on the Thursday and Fridays. If I see something, mainly because the liquidity isn't good enough, but if I see something that stands out, then, I'll obviously place bets. But a lot of it's just really getting yourself prepared for the weekend.
Yeah.
So that how the course is playing, how people are playing, all these different things. If players miss in certain parts, they have a harder shot than you'd expect coming up, and all these different things. So I think with golf's interesting as an in-running sport compared to, say, tennis. So in tennis, there isn't enough time really within a point to be placing that many bets. So most of the time with tennis, you're placing bets at the end of a point. And what you end up with is the models are very good at pricing up. So you have two players at even money, and one player is leading, wins first set, and it's 3-all in the second set. The models are very good at pricing up that sort of stuff because they've seen that scoreline so many times before in terms of the expectations for the two players going forward. Now, you might make a few tweaks in terms of if a player's coming back in terms of some sort of momentum. A player might be struggling with his serve. It might be a bit windier that suits a player, or any of these sorts of things. But as a general rule, you're only betting you're betting on known outcomes in terms of a player's won the point. There's nothing unknown at that point. Whereas with golf, it's a little bit different in that, yes, you have that aspect too when the player makes a birdie or makes a bogey in terms of impacts their position on the leaderboard. But what you end up with golf is you end up with a whole series of moments before that which are unknown and you have opportunity to bet on. So imagine a player's 100 yards out in the rough. You can make a judgment call on that shot coming up as to how difficult it is or otherwise. So there are stats in terms of what the average proximity might be from the rough for that shot. And, you'll know how hard that hole is playing today. And so you have some stats, but there's also a lot of experience that goes into understanding exactly how tough a shot that is and how that actually impacts prices. So you end up with all these, and it might be the same on the green. So I always think of 8 foot is just under 8 foot's the cutoff point between an average player making a putt and missing a putt.
Yeah.
But not every 8 foot putt's the same. So if a player has an 8 foot putt uphill and he's just seen another player make that same putt, he probably makes it 80% of the time. Whereas if it's at Augusta and it has a foot of break and he's having to hit it about 6 inches, then, he might make it 20% of the time. So there's always a difference in terms of, there's always opportunity, should we say, in terms of understanding what's actually going on in front of you.
Yeah.
That I think a lot of other sports don't provide you with.
And is that context, understanding the context of each shot, is that just from experience, or is that some modeling that you have? Is it just use your own eyes or people that you work with? How are you deciding if it's a value?
A mixture. Yeah. So you have certain aspects which is it just experience and understanding, but you're also using some stats in terms of how difficult certain holes are playing that day and things like that. So it's really a mixture, combining both. And it's quite a good way to sort of put some context on it. A lot of it's just experience in terms of watching it. So I'm often asked about, say, something like, what advantages did you have at Betfair? Well, one of the advantages we had is watch sport every day non-stop for 8 hours a day for 8 years. There's worse jobs. But, it's, you're not learning how people are placing bets and what the methodologies they're using and things. But what you are learning is you're learning an awful lot about certain sports in terms of, and you're watching markets and that sort of stuff. So a lot of it comes down to, and also things like preparation. And, so if I see something that gives me pause for thought, I might make a note of it and I can refer back to that at a later date.
That's very interesting experience. I guess the golf has an advantage in terms of against tennis is you have 4 days, you have lots of time to think and react. Whereas if you're betting on football or tennis, you've got to make a very quick decision. Whereas golf gives you a little bit more time. You can assess what the weather is prior to the tournament starting, for example.
I think the hardest thing with golf probably is the fact that you only have realistically 60, 70 events a year to play on. Whereas with tennis, you might have 60 games in a week. So with golf, as things like variance becomes a much bigger issue. And that's one thing about betting and running is you're massively lowering your variance in terms of relative to the big bets placed pre-off, where you can go on some horrendous runs. Is if you're betting and running, it tends to be on much lower prices. Often a lot of the value is actually on the shorter prices, and your variance. There's a huge change in terms of your sort of variance profile.
Yeah, because you can react and you can adjust your positions as needs be. And what's the liquidity like on Betfair? You got this week, for example, we've got 3 tournaments. We've got Live Golf taking place. It's just the PGA at the moment, or are you looking at the DP World and the Live Golf as well?
I mean, strangely, DP World always used to be my favourite. I used to enjoy it more than PGA Tour events. Obviously, more liquidity in PGA Tour events. This week in Italy, it's a good field and it'd be decent liquidity because Rory's playing and etc. So, I mean, a lot depends on who's playing and everything else. Not doing much in terms of Live at the moment, but part of that's because TV coverage isn't great, leaderboards aren't great, and things like that at the moment. That will change as time goes on, no doubt. But as it currently stands, what you're not getting is tons of liquidity into these markets.
No, it makes sense. I think League Golf's just on YouTube at the moment, isn't it? It seems to be improving week by week, and no doubt as more players.
I enjoy it when I watch it and everything else, but it's just as a serious betting proposition, it's not there for me just yet.
Yeah. It's because the reason you're betting in play golf is all about scalability. And I've heard you speak about this before. And that's so important, especially when you're betting at such big stakes as yourselves. But it'll be relevant to other punters perhaps listening. And I always see it as people going on a betting journey. If you're starting off, well, you've got all the bookmaker accounts available to you, plus all your friends and family's accounts, possibly, if you wish to go down that route. But then you might need to segue onto, using exchanges or tackling other markets if the each way angle gets closed off to you, or you can't bet on horse racing. You need to look at, betting on tennis or betting with brokers. And that's your journey, isn't it? But obviously at a higher scale.
I think the thing about scalability is that if you're looking just to make a few pounds here and there and you have access to a full range of bookmaker accounts, you have some pretty decent options. There's a lot of soft markets in terms of some of the smaller markets that bookmakers aren't necessarily paying attention to, but it comes with its own problems. So the example I would use is, let's imagine you have all these soft markets and you have an amazing return on them. You're making 15% per every pound you're placing a bet on. So, and over the course of a year, you've placed £100,000 worth of bets and you're making £15,000 and you think, yeah, this game's easy. But one of the problems you have is that those accounts get closed very quickly and those opportunities dry up pretty quickly. And so when I talk about scalability, is what you need to be looking for is playing into the bigger markets where you can get a lot more money on. Right? So if you're playing football markets or some other markets, you might be able to place £10 million worth of bets in a year, and you may only have a margin of 1%. But your return might be £100,000 instead of the 15,000. You're able to get on. You're not losing accounts in quite the same way, and you have a chance to, if you want to do this job as a full-time professional punter, you need to be able to earn more than £15,000 a year.
Certainly something to consider, whether people have aspirations to do that, but obviously looking at the scalability of it, and you might, the return investment might be lower, but the amount you can get on is higher, and therefore you're making more. So that's a good point. I wanted to move on and talk about the tweets then. That's how you've raised your profile and people are aware of you through your work on Twitter. Now, I said you're up to 109, and obviously people might think tweets, but there are really, the lengthy threads on specific topics. A lot of thought goes into them. What made you start doing all of this, and what is behind the plans to keep doing them?
Okay, so there were a couple of sort of trigger points in the first place. One is I wanted to do a high-profile weight loss bet in last December, and at the time I had 47 followers, and I posted something on Twitter, and I got in touch with someone who's quite big in the fitness side of Twitter, and what came back just wasn't overly satisfactory for me in terms of what I wanted to do. And he said to me, he goes, go out there and you need to raise your profile more. Obviously you need a much bigger audience if that's what you're looking to do, type of thing. And it sort of gave me pause for thought. And then there were a couple of other trigger points. And ultimately, I saw an article in the Racing Post, and it was talking about professional punters, and it was a 3 or 4 day pullout. And it was, honestly, it was garbage. And I thought, this is the main, betting newspaper. Is this really the best that the industry has to offer? And it's charging people for the privilege of that. And I thought, I can do better than that. And I'd like to think that, 109 tweets later, we've provided an awful lot more content at no cost, than what was there at the time. So, and that was sort of where it came from. And as it carries on, who knows where it goes, but I'm enjoying it. I enjoyed the networking aspect in terms of meeting other people, in terms of being in contact with other people. Because one thing about professional punting is, yes, you have a network of friends in terms of who do something similar, but it still can be quite a lonely existence at times, in terms of working from home and everything. So in terms of, I didn't really see any downside of putting myself out there. And yeah, no, I've enjoyed it. You get some people who are hard work, but it's fun as a whole. And, one of the big things for me was, this is an industry where I'm more conscious than most. I think that ultimately I make my money from losing punters, and the same way bookmakers do. And you work for a bookmaker, you're making your money from losing punters. And I think it seems to escape the attentions of a lot of people. And, it doesn't always sit particularly well with me. And, I have an opportunity in terms of, I like to think I have a knowledge of sort of betting and the industry that I can help people from potentially making some of the same mistakes that I've made along the way, or, and sharing some of the knowledge I have. Obviously, the knowledge I'm sharing you're not going to suddenly become a pro punter on the back of it. But, I've had tons of decent feedback from guys who are pro punters who said, oh, I hadn't thought of that, or, this. And I would say that if you, read all 109 tweets or whatever, I'd be surprised if you're not learning quite a lot in terms of the different aspects of the industry.
I've certainly found it really, really illuminating. I've retweeted quite a few of the tweets you've put out, the threads you've put out, and I think they are, whether you agree with them or not, or there's probably some that people disagree with, and we'll talk about that. They do serve an educational purpose, and I think they're quite informative on that front. But what's your take on, the betting industry in general? Because you've seen both sides of it, how the industry works and the attitudes and behaviours of bookmakers especially.
I don't want this just to be a 10-minute rant on hating bookmakers, but I think the industry is in a real mess at the moment, and it feels like it's a bit of a crossroads in terms of where it's going. I think back to when I first started, and it seemed to be a lot more of an even contest between punter and bookmaker. Yes, it was a bit different in that didn't necessarily have, things like odds checker were in its formative stages, and information wasn't as prevalent then as it is now. And, the accounts were still restricted then. But part of the problem is you've got to a stage now where 20 years down the line, the bookmakers, because of a lack of regulation, have literally been able to behave in any way that they've wanted to. Mm-hmm. And some of the practices that are deemed to be standard now, are terrible. And it's not just a simple case of, they're restricting accounts and this sort of stuff, but some of the stuff that they do, things like bet acceptance delays that people won't be fully aware of. Some of the sneaky stuff that they do is just really, really poor form. And the unfortunate thing is, it's just the punter who suffers at the end of the day. It's just another little thing that the bookmakers introduced to help boost their profit. And, so to give you an example in terms of the bet acceptance delay, what I mean by that is in running betting. So if you place a bet on Betfair, it might be a 1 second delay, it might be a 3 second delay, it might be a 5 second delay. But you place that bet, you know that on the 3rd second or the 5th second, that bet goes into the system. It may be matched, it may not be matched, but it's going in a very fair manner. You know exactly what's happening. The problem with in-running betting with bookmakers is you place a bet, let's say on a golf tournament, and you have no idea how long it's going to take for them to accept or decline that bet. Yeah. And the longer that delay is, the more things that can happen, which are to your disadvantage. So if, say, a player has a putt and they make it, they'll reject your bet. Okay. If the player misses it, or I don't know, say something bad happens, is they can accept it, and you're actually in a significantly worse position than you should have been. It's a real mess, honestly. And I look at the whole industry, and obviously you've got affordability checks coming in, and it's difficult really to see light at the end of the tunnel in terms of where things improve. One of the things I always think is, I look at it from, there's 3 or 4 elements to the whole industry. And the problem is the punters at the moment are on their own little island, and they're sort of surrounded by enormous institutions whose interests are all aligned. So what I mean by that is, obviously the bookmakers, they're able to do whatever they please pretty much. Okay. And then you have the media. So you have your Racing Post of the world. We know that all their revenues pretty much come from, whether it be bookmakers adverts, affiliate deals, whether it be the shop newspapers. Very little of their revenues come from normal punters paying for a subscription to the Racing Post. It's a tiny percentage. And so as a consequence, they're never going to badmouth the bookmakers. They're not going to question their behaviors, because they need the bookmakers arguably more than the bookmakers need them. And then the same principle applies to the mainstream media in terms of on TV. And there's so many conflicts of interest within the whole industry that, what you've left with is, it's been 15, 20 years where no one has criticized the sorts of behaviors that the bookmakers have been doing and getting away with. So you see occasionally people come and say, this doesn't seem to be acceptable, and, it's changing a little bit now. But this stuff hasn't been going on for 6 months or 9 months, and it just suddenly happened. This stuff's been going on for years. And, I see media personalities pretending to be punters' friends and all this sort of stuff. And I understand why they don't comment on it, because at the end of the day, their paymasters are the bookmakers. And so it puts them in a very difficult position. But there's very few people out there who are fighting the battles of the punter. Yeah. And then the third aspect to it is the regulator. And the regulator has proven to be absolutely useless. I had a quick look earlier. So the Gambling Act of 2005, I find it relevant because that was just after I joined Betfair. Yeah. And they said they had 3 aims. One was to keep out crime from betting. There was one that was betting to be conducted in a fair and open way. And the other one is protecting children and vulnerable people. And it just feels like they've failed on every single level. Betting as it's become now isn't done in a fair and open way. In terms of things like crime, I was hearing stories even the other day about fob tea machines are a very well-known way to launder money. And I'm hearing that they're doing as much money as they've ever done, even despite the stake restrictions, which I found pretty mind-blowing. And I need that to be confirmed by someone else. But, and then you have all the situations in terms of problem gambling and, Entain, obviously, only 3 or 4 weeks ago, getting a £17 million fine. It's not the first time they've been fined regarding it. S-Markets got fined last week, I believe. Something similar again. And, until the Gambling Commission actually turns around and actually takes away someone's license and says, you can't keep doing this stuff. We're not going to keep warning you and warning you and warning you. It's not acceptable for someone to deposit, I don't know, £500,000 in a year with no checks and losing £500,000. It's just not acceptable for what we're wanting to do. And until that changes, then nothing's really going to improve in the industry. And I know the affordability checks are being brought in to try and counter that. But the one thing I would always say is the bookmakers have done so many things over the years, and particularly abused things like data. They know exactly who has issues of problem gambling and all these other things. They have had the data and the tools to know who the winning punters are and all this sort of stuff for so many years. It's not difficult for them to know who their best customers are and their rates they lose money at and all these other things and how many deposits they've made. And, they have all the tools in the world to identify winning gamblers. It's not that difficult to imagine that they can identify who problem gamblers might be. And I think what's shown is that they can't be trusted to be involved in the process of deciding what comes up in the next review, because they've shown time and time again they can't be trusted. They'll just abuse their position of power.
That's a good point. And you talked there about Entain's 17 million fine. That's a small proportion of their overall profits for the past year. So it's a cost of doing business.
Well, I will tell you a story where I was talking to someone recently, and he said to me, he works for a fund, and their fund owns shares in Entain. And he said he didn't even know that they'd had the fine until he'd read the tweet I'd made about it. And that gives you an idea as to how insignificant that fine is to Entain. And as you say, it's just a cost of doing business. And it can't ever be that way.
No, that's a good way of checking the impact of anything that you might read in the news about the betting industry. How are the share prices holding up? And invariably, if they're not tanking, then no one's concerned. Luke, so let's say you're in charge of determining the future of the betting industry. What decisions would you make to make it better and more fairer?
Good question. I think it's a really difficult question, and I think you have to get back to basics a little bit. And I hear people say all the time where bookmakers shouldn't be compelled to take a bet, and if they don't want this customer, they shouldn't have to have this customer, and all this sort of things. And my counter argument to that is always, well, if you want a license to operate as a bookmaker, then there should be certain criteria that you have to fulfill. And the big one for me is that if you offer prices on a site, you shouldn't be able to discriminate between who is taking that price in the way that they currently are. And whether that is in the shape of minimum bet laws, how that looks. At the end of the day, a bookmaker doesn't have to offer a price, right? It doesn't have to offer a market. It can limit. So we've seen on special bets over the years that if a bookmaker only wants to take a £50 liability on a market, it has the tools to set it up so they only take a £50 liability on a market. They have all these tools available to them. The idea of being a bookmaker is that you are laying bets to customers, and it shouldn't matter who that customer is. And don't get me wrong, if a customer behaves in a bad way, and I know it happens in terms of if, say, they're rude and abusive to staff, or they're messing around in terms of trying to beat time to bet delays, or some of the other sorts of poor behavior that they could undertake, then I can understand why the bookmaker may not want them as their custom. Okay, you don't have a sort of a God-given right to be able to place bets if you behave badly, but it should be moved back to being a system that is much fairer in terms of the sort of battle between bookmaker and punter, and it has to be regulated properly. And we have to get away from a situation where someone can deposit most of their life savings in an account on an evening and lose it in a casino. I've always said in my tweets and everything else, if someone wants to lose all their money gambling, right, you do very well to stop them. You won't stop them. They will find different ways of getting on. It might be in shops, it might be online. It's very difficult to stop, okay? And what you have to try and do is just make sure that if they are going to do that, then it takes them a long time and an awful lot of effort to do that. Yeah. And it can't be something that just happens overnight or over a 2-day period type of thing. And I think that's where the whole sort of problem gambling side of things, where I get frustrated that people in the industry don't really acknowledge it, because it is a massive problem, and that problem's not going away.
Of course, and it's raising, if you like, issues of affordability, which are impacting those of us who bet. And so until we get a better solution, or someone in charge, whether it be the regulator or government, whoever it is, to make better decisions for a scalable bookmaking sector, and that works for both punters and bookmakers in a fair way.
Part of the problem with affordability is that I've had times where, if I lose £5,000 in a night, that will hurt me more than if I lose £100,000 in a night. Okay, so it's very difficult to get a system right in terms of scale, where one sort of glove fits all. It's very difficult to do, but at the very least they have to try. And I'm not saying that affordability checks and, again, part of the problem is do I trust the bookmaker with intrusive checks? No, because, a lot of the time a bookmaker's asking for bank statements and things like that is to see if people have been putting money into your account because you might be multi-accounting type of thing. So I don't trust the bookmakers to do it properly. And part of the problem is I don't really trust the gambling commission to do it well either. So it's a worry going forward. And, what the exact solution is, I'm not really sure, to be honest.
If someone came to you and said, I fancy doing what you do now, Luke, obviously you're embedded, if you like, within the industry, you've got all this bankroll and you've got a way of betting. Would you tell them to go and do something different instead, another industry?
Not necessarily. I think there might have been times when I said, don't even think about it. But if you have a true passion for it in terms of sports, if you have an edge that you believe in and not just like a whimsical, I think I've got an edge, or, if you can prove you can make money on some of the bigger markets, then, there's a lot of benefits to the industry. But I think you have to just be conscious that there are quite a few downsides and things can change very quickly. I wouldn't be an automatic no, don't do it. But you also have to be incredibly realistic and know exactly what you're getting into.
Yeah. And be quite adaptable, I imagine. Obviously, you've changed over the years and, be someone that's willing to shift and not be embedded to one particular market or strategy and be flexible like that. So thank you ever so much for your time today, Luke. You've really illuminated a lot of different topics there, and I think it's been very informative. I've enjoyed listening to you. What I did want to ask you, Luke, did you win the weight loss bet? Did that ever go ahead?
No, it's not happened yet. So
okay.
I'm going to do it at some point. It's been a long year, so we haven't got round to it yet. So we will get round to it at some point.
After Christmas, perhaps.
Well, hopefully before Christmas, but we will. I'm sure it'll be all over Twitter, and it is what it is. But thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah. What are the plans? What are your plans for the future? Obviously, you're going to continue going on with up to 109. You're going to keep tweeting. You've got a website now. Do you want to put the link in as well?
propunting.co.uk. The only reason I really did the website was just so that one of the things that people used to say to me all the time is Twitter's not particularly great in terms of scrolling through different tweets. So by putting them into a blog, it meant that you can see all 109 topics listed in sort of a list format. So you can click on each one and read it. It's much more user-friendly format. But there's no intention of doing anything of note with it apart from it just being a much easier resource for people to use. I'll just keep going as we are at the moment, but always just conscious that in this industry that regulations, affordability checks, anything can happen at any time, and you just have to make sure you don't put all your eggs in one basket, and if any changes do come, it doesn't completely mess things up for you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I look forward to seeing, the next 109 tweets or however many. And
I'm not sure about that.
I'm sure there's going to be content for it. I'm sure in the betting industry in the world, there'll be plenty of content. So thank you ever so much, Luke. Go check propunting.co.uk. I'll chuck in your Twitter handle in the show notes as well. And go follow Luke, because I've really enjoyed reading your tweets. I've really enjoyed listening to you today, and look forward to seeing more from you in the future. Thank you, Luke.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.